Thank you, Erin. Well, again, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to have you all here. Also, I'm particularly glad to have met all of you, Giulia, Traci, and Isadora, before this event, and I'm glad to have you all here. It's a great opportunity to hear from your work. The first person speaking will be Semblanza Isadora Hastings Garcia. Isadora is a founding partner alongside engineer Gerson Huerta of the nonprofit organization Cooperación Comunitaria. Since 2010, she has been coordinating this organization, where processes related to habitat production and social management, as well as comprehensive reconstruction in rural communities in Mexico's most vulnerable states, has been developed. This initiative have involved the implementation of participatory processes with comprehensive and systematic approach achieved through knowledge dialogue. Since 2020, she has served as an academic at the National Academy of Architecture of Mexico. Moreover, in 2023, she became a member of the Council representing Latin America of the Habitat International Coalition. She holds a master's in architecture from UNAM and the Polytechnic University of Madrid. Thank you, Isadora, for being here.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you all. And thanks to the LSU Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab for the invitation to this Caribbean Perspective Colloquium. Today, I will share my screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Well, I will share, as you said, the work of Cooperación Comunitaria. And I would like to give some context of Mexico. With almost 70% of the world's variety of plants and animals, Mexico is one of the most mega-diverse countries in the world. But also due to its geography, it's exposed to different social-natural phenomena like volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, earthquakes, and much more of these phenomena. Here, as you can see in the map, these states in the South and the Pacific coast are the most vulnerable, not only in terms of social margination and natural hazards, but the impact of climate change. So those states that we work with are the most vulnerable in Mexico. And also, as we see in this map, Guerrero, well, there are like 300 social environmental conflicts due to extractivism mega projects interested in several natural resources that do not consider the decisions of the communities that live in those territories. And so they have displaced this population because of these mega projects. As I said already, Mexico is one of the most mega-diverse countries, and the complex orography of the national territory gives its diversity of environment, soils, and climates. And these, of course, have brought like human settlements for centuries, have adapted to these diverse conditions. And the diversity of houses that you see here has been built for by indigenous groups, adequate to different ecosystems and with natural and local materials. So behind this construction, there is also an empiric traditional constructive knowledge, but unfortunately in Mexico, like in other Latin American countries, these architectures have not been seen as a heritage, and so the knowledge is distinguishing as well as the traditional housing. In the cities of Mexico, around 67% have been built by the people, without any technical advice or planning and without involving any architect. This has caused some risk, high density, and many other problems. But on the other hand, as well, it has developed a way of living that nowadays it's important to understand as an architect in order to design based on people's real needs. And well, we have seen since 80 decade, Mexico started to introduce neoliberalism policies. And one of the first changes was the privatization of social housing, letting the construction responsibility to profit enterprises, while the state became just a facilitator and intermediary of this type of housing. This is one of many examples of the cluster for social housing that have been built by private initiatives and doesn't consider the needs and different characteristics of the families that live there. The same has happened in rural areas where these enterprises have built clusters following the same patterns of the urban spaces without considering rural family needs, their culture, environment, and so on. And so we have noticed in these last decades that the main problem is public housing policy has encouraged a quantitative perspective over the quality of dwellings. Here you can see the difference between urban and rural housing, not only in their typology, but in different ways of living or using spaces. Rural dwellings are usually built with the kitchen, laundry space, and bathrooms separate from the living and sleeping areas. And they are built on larger plots of land where there is a space to raise animals and food as well. So, well, in these pictures, you can see as well the difference. The right-hand pictures shows a reconstruction project made by a private enterprise. So we have been working with traditional housing in rural areas, and we have found out that the traditional housing has a deep relation with the territory. It keeps constructive traditional knowledge in the way of building. Also, traditional housing is a productive housing, and it's surrounded by a ritually based on the cosmovision of the groups who live there. So, well, now I talked about Cooperación Comunitaria, the organization I work for. It was created in 2010 as a non-profit organization that aims to reduce vulnerability and increase habitability of rural communities in Mexico. And with a comprehensive and systemic approach that relate the different areas, territorial, environmental, sociocultural, constructive, and productive, and with an interdisciplinary team, exchanging traditional and academic knowledge in order to generate self-management of the communities. This approach consists in a participatory and training during the whole processes to increase people's capabilities for resilience. And our work is based on social production of habitat that follows all these stages, starting from community assessment, participatory design, planning and organization, implementation, evaluation, use, and maintenance. And the groups participate in each stage, while Cooperación Comunitaria, well, the team of Cooperación Comunitaria give technical advice and social accompaniment during the whole process. And I mean, this participatory way of working, promote people's organization, increasing their technical skills, and as well making decisions related to their own processes. In order to reduce vulnerability, we also work with integral comprehensive risk management, that on one hand, we strengthen the constructive, productive, and environmental structures so the communities are able to resist social natural hazards. And on the other hand, we also improve community resilience through the increase of people's learning and capabilities to recover more easily from any disaster. And we work through two programs. One is the social production of habitat that work with organized groups. That is the case of Hidalgo and Chiapas, building some places to produce and to also training other communities members. The second one is the comprehensive reconstruction of habitat post-disaster. And this is the case of Guerrero and Oaxaca that I will talk about today. And the third one is advocacy and knowledge exchange with public institution, private agency, in network with other organizations, institutions, and universities. I will present briefly the comprehensive reconstruction in Guerrero after Ingrid and Manuel hurricanes in 2013. Guerrero, as I said, it is a state located in the south of Mexico, placed in the most seismic zone, and as well hurricane threats. So as you can see, after these two hurricanes that hit the zone, there were damages not only in roads, crops, but as well in the houses that most of them were made of adobe. So when we got there, we started doing a community assessment, and we design and apply this comprehensive approach in a community, in the first community named El Obispo. First, we analyze risk. So we realized that landslides were related to deforestation and soil degradation. So we started with to do some workshops for reforestation and soil restoration by agroecological practices. We built as well wood-saving stoves in order to reduce deforestation. And as well, we proposed the self-production of composting toilets to contribute to reduce the use of water, and as well, composting crops to improve the soils. As for the constructive aspects, we, based on the analysis of traditional house, we reinforced the structural system to make it more resistant to earthquakes and hurricanes. And here you can see some of the works that we made with these communities, participatory design, and also the structure analysis for adobe houses. And we proposed this system, reinforced adobe house. And then the communities start working on rebuild their homes. As you can see, well, some of them. Also, we restored some heritage houses that were really damaged. And at the end, we made this analysis comparing the adobe house with the adobe house we have built with people, compare with this other industrialized material house. And we found out that housing made of adobe is 151% more economic and 57% more eco-friendly than the industrialized material housing. As well, we, after this analysis, to know the relation of cost and the type of material that we have found as well, that we use the 90% of the house volume is made of local and natural material and represents between 46 and 51% of the total cost, while the 10% of the volume made of industrialized material, because we use some cement, some steel, represents as well between 49 and 54% of the cost. So that's quite interesting. After these 10 years that we have been working there, we start working as well with students in primary and secondary school, some of and in the intercultural university, we have do some classrooms, adobe classrooms with them, recovering the traditional construction. Also, we have work in the terms of self-management of water and woods and in environmental restoration, no? And those are some of this work. And as well, we, as I said, we have worked with these students as well in self-production of composting dry toilets for reduced water consumption. Also, in order to reduce the vulnerability of women, we have worked with them with these wood saving stoves that reduce the 62% of deforestation. And at the same time, we work in, we carry on this forest restoration process. Okay, and I quickly will jump to Oaxaca. While we were working in Guerrero and all the learnings we have, gathered from that project, we start working after the earthquakes in 2017 in the south part of Oaxaca, as well in the Pacific coast, where there are settled two different ethnic communities, the Binisa and the Icots. They, after this big earthquake, many of the traditional houses were damaged, and not only that, but the private enterprises with the government start demolishing the traditional houses that could have been being safe because they were not really damaged, no? But of course they have all this business of reconstruction with new houses. So all the materials were thrown to the river and without recovering any material. And their proposal was to build this prototype housing that they build everywhere in Mexico. But we, with other organizations, proposed a comprehensive and social reconstruction from the people. And because of the experience we had in Guerrero already, we propose as well this comprehensive reconstruction, not only considering housing, but the production infrastructure and so on. And after an assessment as well to know the causes of the affectations by the earthquakes in the traditional housing, we had 3 different types of traditional construction systems. So we propose a reconstruction and reinforcement of these traditional houses to make them more resistant to earthquakes. And we start working with the communities, increasing construction capabilities and so on, to rebuild a new house on one hand, recovering the traditional housing that we saved from demolition, and we also recover and reconstruct or restart these houses well, adobe houses and bajareke houses. How is the time? Because maybe I have to quit here, or
I would say yes.
okay, so it's, I mean, I just wanted to show you there is an analysis, but then I can maybe in some question talk about it.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Perfect, Isadora. Thank you so much. You know this already, but I mean, your work and your team's work is fascinating. So thank you for showing us that. Now I will move with Giulia. First, I would say that I had the pleasure to meet Giulia in Italy, in Venice, where we were doing our PhD together. Also both focusing on I would say topics and problems that were happening in Latin America. So that also gave us something else to discuss and talk about. More formally, Giulia Testori is a project officer at the B3 unit, which is Territorial Development of the JRC, Joint Research Center of the European Commission. She analyzes strategies of urban and territorial development at spatial and policy level, developing evidence-based methodological support to policymaking. Previously, she was research fellow in critical urban studies at University of Leeds on a British Academy-funded project titled Nova Vida, an investigation center on developing novel approaches for post-disaster in Ecuador. She holds 2 PhDs in urbanism and architecture from EUF, University of Venice, and KU Leuven. Her PhD thesis investigated on the spatial implications of migas in Quito, Ecuador. The thesis received a special mention at the 3rd Manuel de Sola Morales European Prize in 2021. In 2018, she was urban technical consultant for UN Habitat Mexico and Cuba. She graduated with magna cum laude from the Master of Urbanism and Strategic Planning at QUL and holds the European Postgraduate Masters in Urbanism. So, Giulia, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Fabio, and thank you so much, everyone. Isadora, fascinating your presentation. I've been following you since many years, as precisely as Fabio was mentioning. I also work on post-reconstruction of a big earthquake in Ecuador in 2016. So really, really, really interesting. And I think that what I will present to you now connects quite a lot with what Isadora showed. But as Fabio introduced me, this is about my PhD thesis. It was a thesis that I finished in 2019. In urbanism, no. So the topic of the thesis is Quitopia, collective city making, participation, and autonomy in Quito. So we just heard about rural community cooperation in Mexican rural areas. Now I would like to give you an overview of this research that is based in Ecuador. The broad objective of the research was to challenge the way in which cities are planned toward a more inclusive approach. You might ask yourself why an Italian PhD student living in Belgium has been choosing to work on Ecuador. It is indeed a little bit weird, but it's all started by reading an article related to the Ecuadorian constitution. I don't know if all of you know, but in 2008, Ecuador published this new constitution, which is called of the Buen Vivir. This constitution it's full of interesting aspects. For example, let's see very quickly this Article 31. This talks about the right to the city, the right to public space, the right to difference, preservation of territorial cultures, social function of property. Then we have other two that concern participation. They mention citizen power, autonomy, direct democracy. So as you see, something that is not exactly common in constitutions. This one, however, it says that under no circumstances, if there are processes of autonomy, a process of secession should happen. But in recent experiences, I couldn't find this, let's say, institutionalized ideals put into practice. Not when I was doing the thesis. So, in response to this gap between theory and practice, I posed this research question, which was considering the opportunities and challenges presented by the Buen Vivir on topic as participation and autonomy. In what way can collective city making reduce Quito's inequality? And what role can urbanism play in this setting? So let's say that in many contributions discussed by decolonial studies, for example, authors do consider topics as reciprocity, post-capitalism, communality, but always on a theoretical level. The thesis, I don't have time to go so much into depth, but try to make those concepts more operational and try to unbridge an alternative free from Western capitalism construction. And what this would signify, it would signify an utopia, at least, as it is built, no, and as it is described. But while doing this institutional reading, I was also doing fieldwork, and I came to know that Ecuador has a very old history of participation related to city making. And in none of the policies I was analyzing, this culture of city making was taken into account. And what I refer to is what Fabio was mentioning at the beginning, that is the Minga. I don't know if all of you know, but the Minga, it's quite a specific word that literally means promising help to get something in return. A Minga usually is called to involve the group of people that work collectively on a particular task. The work is done for free and in the interest of the community, so there is no money involved. The Minga indeed has equivalent meaning in Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, but also outside America, in Finland, in Ghana, for example. So Mingas are meetings of people that work collectively on a task. It can serve to, it served in the past to construct irrigation canals, pave roads, create a square, erect a bridge, build a roof or a house, but also plant trees, for example, to avert erosion. We just heard about something very similar in Mexico, or clean a common space. And the actors that are generally involved can be a group of relatives, of citizens, of neighborhoods, of members of sport leagues. We can see lots of different examples. But generally, the state is not involved. In the 70s, for Ecuador represented a turning point. So it is described as a momentum where many things coincided. For example, there were agricultural reform, but overall, the state decided to exploit and nationalize the extraction of oil. This created an effect that attracted thousands and thousands of campesinos living in rural areas to the capital, Quito. But the state was not providing for services and not social housing. So you see in those maps that Quito has exploded from the 17th onwards. And of course, one of the main way of finding a piece of land was by occupying the land. In this risk, however, what I try to do in red, you see that there are neighborhoods that have been self-constructed by using mingas. This is not precise. This is a study that I did through interviews and archive research. And you see that by overlapping it with the risk of landslides, for example, or income by neighborhoods, you see that they are located still nowadays in the poorest areas of the city. The thesis analyzed 3 case studies. The 3 of them were developed by mingas. So you see it was Comité del Pueblo, Atucucho, and Comuna de Santa Clara. They are quite different. So this is to show that mingas have been developed, co-opted, changed over time. Atucucho, for example, was an invasion of land, like the one I just mentioned in the 80s. The second one is a communal land, La Comuna de Santa Clara San Millán. It is present in Quito since pre-colonial times. And the last one, super interesting case, is Comité del Pueblo. It was a neighborhood completely constructed by the people, but let's say guided and planned by the Faculty of Architecture of Quito. This is from the 1970s, and the Marxist Communist Leninist Party in a process of an experimentation of, let's say, planning and building Tuminga. Here, just some maps now that show how fast this process has been. And here you can see that since the beginning, there are groups of leaders that managed first actions, for example, connection to water. This is Atucucho in the 80s. They were calling it Ciudad de los Palitos, city of sticks. And then connection to electricity. And women, often pregnant, were the real constructor and fulcrum of the communal life development. The assembly, a complex machine of dialogue where decisions are taken through direct democracy, were the bone of this process. But let's look at those processes with an eye of an architect, of an urbanist, particularly me coming from Europe. It's very easy to criticize these places, either because they are statics, they're often precarious settlements, there is little coherence between buildings, the styles, the lack of public spaces and services, but also from the other side, it's quite easy to romanticize the efforts of the poor. But my real interest was to understand how these events, actors, and mingas shaped this territory, because they represent a way of doing urbanism that cannot simply be tagged as informal. And this is a way of representing one of the case studies. I won't have the time now, but you see, it's a little bit complex. There is a methodology that I called chronotopoline, space-time line. It has on the x-axis lots of events. So it's time, events that happened inside Atucucho. When it was built the first school, when the assemblies were done, when they had interaction with external partners. And on the top part are the national events, so the different presidents, big events, big reforms, and so on. So while you put all these things together, I try to represent that space on the z-axis. And as you see, this red line is not the topography, it's the intensity of participation. There are moments in which people tend to cooperate, either for need, either for willingness, and moments where much less. So you see, now you saw it very quickly, but all the red dots are basically things that have been done through collective city making. Here there are some zoom in, so you can see either deforestation, building of a slope, creation of new roads, school, sport field, and so on. But let's go quickly to Quitopia and why this title. So Quitopia tries to give an answer to the research question by imagining an utopian future for Quito based on lessons learned from each case study. I attempt to envision how to face metropolitan issues by combining the institutional potential offered by the Buen Vivir framework, and I pose some scenario where the Minga practice returns to the center of collective spaces creation and maintenance. It basically interprets the Minga in a new way. In Utopia, the Minga has a central law. Assemblies do exist in every neighborhood and are supported by the state. The state contributes with building materials and provides supports to neighborhood assemblies with experts, for example, with urbanists, architects, and anthropologists. But where Mingas could be done, obviously not everything can be managed by Mingas. I would never imagine that an hospital is built by a Minga or a highway, for example. But it's true that there is a galaxy of more minute spaces that in the past have been shaped by Mingas. And so I try to map them in this exercise, taking some existing Mingas, for example, in local parks. And then I try to map all local parks. Then I take some example for Mingas that have been done in rivers, and I map all rivers. I do the same with ravines and the same with sport fields. So at the end, I tried to build a metropolitan plan where hypothetically all spaces mapped previously are co-constructed and managed by Mingas. Then I mapped their potential radius of influence. It could cover such a section of neighborhood, like in the case of the people that could be involved in cleaning a park, or of a neighborhood, like the example that of cases where Mingas have been done all along rivers. In conclusion, I know I bombarded you with lots of information, but I would just like to pass a couple of, I think, key messages. So I think that urban participation and autonomy are clearly not themselves the only key to solve problems at the in contemporary metropolis, but I'm convinced that local know-how is central to implement them. And through this urban proposal of Utopia, of course, many questions remain open. Can this methodology be extended to other contexts, to look far behind and try to reach it somehow? And to what extent are decisions made by citizens and experts in assembly something that can work to really have a right to the city? But for here, I take it as an invite to policy beyond to make more advantage of the many existing laws on participation and autonomy, and try to shift a position of control to a shift to a facilitator. And I believe that just in this way, we can start making the colonial principle into practice. And I invite students to touch subjects that often seem untouchable, something as sacred as a constitution, to place on the table of discussion the word alternative and the profitable interrelation between different disciplines vis-a-vis a more inclusive stimulus. Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Giulia, so much. I mean, among other things, I think that you are like bringing to the lights at least a few of the processes that are not visible for those that don't really understand what's happening, or that generally are focused on a more, I would say, formal way of making cities. So I really appreciate your work, and I think it will be very, very interesting for everyone here. Now I would like to introduce Traci Birch. I would say first, also a personal comment. I would say that first, I'm jealous of Traci's energy, and also, I mean, she has become key since I think some of us came to Louisiana to understand like what's happening here. Again, coming from that side, she has been able to tell us some of the most important topics that we should be focusing, and I think that's very, I mean, we're very thankful for that. Again, formally, Traci Birch is the interim managing director of the LSU Coastal Sustainability Studio and an assistant professor in the LSU School of Architecture. Her particular focus is ecosystem management and facilitating local implementation of regional planning efforts. Traci completed her master's in urban and regional planning and her PhD in urban studies and environmental management, both from the University of New Orleans. She also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree with concentration in graphic design and media production from Baldwin Wallace University. Before joining CSS, which is the Coastal Sustainability Studio, Traci spent 10 plus years in private sector as a practicing planner in Louisiana and the Gulf South. Her teaching experience includes graduate and undergraduate studies and seminars in coastal sustainability and environmental planning. She has previously taught at East Carolina University and the University of New Orleans. Traci is also a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the American Planning Association. Thank you, Traci.
Thank you, Fabio, for that. Let me go ahead and get this started. There we go. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Fabio. And I'm just going to say a few things for context. I am actually no longer an interim director. I am the associate director, and the studio has changed its name from the Coastal Sustainability Studio to the Coastal Ecosystem Design Studio. So I'll give a little bit of context for that really quickly. We were previously the Coastal Sustainability Studio, and we combined efforts with another center on campus called the Center for Coastal Resilience, which was really a kind of a coastal modeling studio. So what we did was add to our capacity, which was primarily in the design and planning fields with coordination in engineering and social sciences. We've added a lot of the natural science capacity to that so that we can kind of look at these issues as a more holistic ecosystem design versus two separate silos of people. And we work very closely with a range of agencies, all the way from agencies like the FEMA or the Federal Emergency Management Agency to the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority at the state, multiple LSU entities, whether it's Sea Grant or the Ag Center, local governments, and then nonprofits as well. There we go. And what our goal is through the studio is to really try to speak a common language. So these three maps you see here are all maps of the lower Mississippi River. And you know, as LSU, we sit right on this river, but each one of these are drawn by a different entity. The one on the left is a historic Fisk map looking at the historic meanders of the river. The one in the center is the Corps of Engineers, who's really concerned just with the amount of water flow. And then there are these historic maps about how land developed in place. So we kind of try to bring these together so that people who speak these separate languages can start collaborating. We are not located on campus. You can see this little map here. We are very close to the main campus, but we are actually on the water campus, which is a collaborative effort between the state of Louisiana, nonprofits such as the Water Institute of the Gulf, and local foundations to try and coalesce a water economy in the state of Louisiana that's addressing issues related to coastal land loss and coastal management. So for those who don't know, this is the kind of map of Louisiana. We sit at the South Louisiana is the delta of the Mississippi River, so it is a fairly unstable landscape. I show you this map because this is how you see it in an atlas, and this is the reality. This is what is actual land in the state of Louisiana. Everything else that is white is water. And so we live in a landscape that is prone to flooding, prone to storms, and all of those things significantly impacting communities in the coast. Again, this is South Louisiana. You can see a range of communities that sit on these edges. This is the projected land loss through the next 40 years or so, which means we have many communities in the state that sit in places that may not even be there in 50 years from now. But that are very much sitting on the edge and dealing with these kind of compounded impacts of hazards. And this is what land loss looks like. It's not a kind of constant swiping away at the edge, but rather a deterioration of the land itself so that it eventually just becomes open water. And that impacts those communities right on the edge, but it also impacts those communities inland as coastal processes and coastal protection kind of what coastal processes move inland, but coastal protection disappears. Communities that have historically thought that they were safe are finding themselves more prone to flooding and disaster impacts. So the work that I do really sits within this continuum. This is the federal government's recovery continuum. This is as your community is impacted by a disaster, this is the process you go through. There is a lot of money and resources and capacity when you look at that short term in the days and weeks, perhaps months after you're impacted by a disaster, but the real hard work comes in that long-term recovery, and there are often few resources, few people left on the ground, and little opportunity for communities to make change because they don't have the capacity to do this work in the long term. So I show this just to say this is where I bring my research, but also the resources that I have through the studio to try and address and work with communities in this realm. So we do that in many different ways. Here's a few bullet points because it'll help connect the dots to all the things I'm going to show you. I run workshops with mayors and elected officials in communities that have been impacted by disaster, trying to understand what it is that they think they need in order to become more resilient and recover from the impacts that they've had. I have several projects that I've worked on that are supported by the National Academies of Sciences through the Gulf Research Program. This is an entity that was funded after the BP oil spill to work directly with communities. So while the National Academies is a kind of typical, maybe NSF funded format, through the Gulf Research Program, their mission has been to work directly with communities. We do work with the National Science Foundation. We also work with the Corps of Engineers, who in the United States who builds infrastructure and has typically built kind of like large walls and big pumps and not thought a lot about the ecosystems that they're working in, nor have they thought much about the communities on the other side of that infrastructure, short of a kind of cost benefit analysis. So we pull these funding sources together to be able not just to do kind of original research, but also to engage students and departments across campus in multidisciplinary education opportunities that are supporting the research, but also training the next generation of professionals to speak a common language and to learn early how to work across boundaries and work with each other. So I'm just going to run through, I know my time is short here, but I'll run through a couple of examples of how we do this. Inland from the Coast was a program finished in 2021, supported by the National Academies of Sciences, that worked directly with those communities that are experiencing coastal impacts, but are located pretty far from the coast. Those places I mentioned that had historically thought they were safe, but really aren't. This was a 4-year project. We engaged 32 graduate assistants and 4 postdoc researchers. And we worked in 4 separate communities around South Louisiana to really do deep dives into what it is those communities needed to become more resilient and address some of the issues they have in place. So this particular community is Baker. Again, we kind of came in and provided extra staff for these communities. This is a fairly well-developed community, suburban community, but has flooding issues, extreme flooding issues, but also kind of common everyday flooding issues that they needed to address. And so what we did is identify through bringing engineering students and design, and when I say design, we say landscape planning and architecture students together to identify issues and opportunities within these communities. So this is a subdivision with pretty well built out within the community. And what we did is work with them to reimagine what this place could look like if it could absorb stormwater during storms. Of course, also finding ways to enhance quality of life on the day-to-day. We looked at, this is a separate community, somewhat similar approach. This is breaking it down in ways so that the community would be able to apply for funding, kind of understand how they might break down those funding sources and phasing of projects. So as they went to try and build things, we provided them that information. Here's another example just of a community or of a place in the community. There was once a house. There were actually 2 houses here that had been removed, and it just kind of sat as a vacant lot. And we helped the community imagine how that might shift to be a more kind of used piece of the community, but also absorb stormwater. And I should say that in each of these cases, the meetings and a lot of the renderings and things like this were done by students, and students working directly with communities in partnership with researchers. There we go. And again, these were graphics and ideas that were put together and packaged for the community so that they might be able to go for funding. It wasn't kind of original research where we wanted to hang on to it, but rather everything was intended to be given to the communities and packaged in a way that could apply for grant funding. So another program that we have is called, it's the DEEDS program. It's Developing Engineering Practices for Ecosystem Design Solutions. This is a 4-year program funded through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their Engineering with Nature program. And it is to try to understand how to enhance nature-based solutions to alter the way the Corps of Engineers typically thinks about building infrastructure. So the component of this that I work very closely with is the summer internship program. This is just giving you a picture of our most recent summer interns. This is our 2nd year that we did it. We brought in 20 students from 10 different disciplines, 8 separate universities, and a real mix of PhD, undergrad, and grad students. They come to work with us for 8 weeks, and they are divided into 4 teams that are addressing issues related to coastal land loss and coastal land building within the Gulf of Mexico region. So here, the small stars are the projects we did last year. The kind of larger red and yellow stars are the projects we worked on this summer. We started kind of in a tight-knit mix along. What this is the Barataria Basin, and we are slowly over the years expanding our reach out a little bit further. Each one of these sites has a community partner or series of community partners that we work with so that the information the students produce can be used by each of these community partners when the students leave. So this is just a quick example of one that we did. This is actually in Biloxi, Mississippi. We partnered with Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, with Mississippi State University, with the city of Biloxi, and with the U.S. Air Force to try and address some issues of shoreline erosion on the back bay of Biloxi. Here you can see our study area. Keesler Air Force Base is to the left, and then Hiller Park is owned by the city to the right, and in between is actually the Veterans Hospital. The entire shoreline being lost to erosion over time, which is destabilizing both the park but also the Air Force Base. So we had a team of 4 students who worked together. They come from a range of disciplines and a range of universities. And they had a chance to really work with the community partners to understand what the issues were on the ground. They did quite a bit of background research that is both what exists today, but also what will climate change mean for this place? How much land will be lost? What are the threats that this area is going to face due to climate change? And how did they start to think about designing for that? They set a series of design goals in partnership with the community partners to try and understand what they might be able to accomplish. They really dove deep into what the challenges might be, working with engineering students and local engineers to try and understand that. And then finally creating a series of design recommendations that might make a difference in the future. So they looked at what would storm surge look like, but also what will climate change look like, and how would you actually think about designing spaces that can adapt over time to absorb this stormwater. They thought about habitats, some of which are not in great shape today. How would they be able to enhance those, but how would they also be able to encourage the kind of migration of habitats, whether it's mangroves or seagrasses or things like this. And then finally, what would the engineering of this site actually look like? How would they start to move dirt today in a way that could hold on to it for the future? This is within the park. They also looked at the Air Force Base, and created a series of designs that would protect those edges and then be able to shift over time. So they looked at kind of marsh mounds that would work today to protect the shoreline, but also be able to absorb, shift to mangrove habitats, which is what they expect to be in the area in about the next 10 to 15 years. They looked at both kind of landscape features, but also structural features. How might you be able to protect these edges in a way to enhance habitat and some of these kinds of things? We had them do deep dives into what those ecosystem services might be, both from what they could accomplish, but what the priorities of their community partners were. And then finally, they really did start to think about performance benefits. And this is some of the work we're continuing to do today is how do we actually use the modeling capabilities we have to think about alternatives and then work towards implementation of some of these ideas. And then finally, and again, I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and go through this pretty quickly. This is where some of it comes together. So we are funded through the National Academies of Sciences to do multidisciplinary studios where we are pulling students out of the education experience, but actually pulling them together in ways that are very difficult to do through university processes. And so the National Academies has funded 2 years of multidisciplinary design studios. They started last fall. This was my studio in particular. We worked on Grand Isle in one of those communities where I both worked with the mayor previously, and we worked through the deeds program. We brought an option studio, which brings students from architecture and landscape architecture together. They worked with, again, community partners, which included the city of Grand Isle, the US Coast Guard. We also worked with the local schools. So this picture on the bottom left is high school students from Grand Isle who my LSU students had a chance to interview and who came to see the reviews at the end of the semester. And these really looked at how would you be able to hold on to an island that is threatened with loss over time. And so it was both structural, but it was also landscape features. It is a maritime forest, and thinking about how to enhance that maritime forest edge to hang on to the island over the long term. They again worked with communities and people. They had to think through engineering issues, landscape issues, social issues, to come up with plans and recommendations that could enhance this island over the long term. I'll put this slide in here. This is a shout out to Fabio, who in the spring of last year, we then expanded it beyond a single course to collaborate, to have 3 separate courses collaborate with each other, again, working with mayors that had come to work with the studio. And these guys were architecture, landscape architecture, and civil engineering, and thinking through a proposed project in the Lake Charles area that can help reduce flooding impacts over time and enhance social elements within the landscape. Looking at my time here. And so with this grant, our next steps are, Haley Blakeman and I at LSU are engaging 2 additional studios and 2 additional communities in Southwest Louisiana. We are also expanding that to work with students from across the campus, including graphic design, honors students, the Gulf research scholars, and others. And this work will have its own symposium and exhibition in March to highlight the work, but then how it's all come together across disciplines and over time. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Traci, so much. As I knew it was going to be, that was very intense, not only in the amount of work, but also, I mean, how impressive the things that you have been able to do, you know, to make possible and to make real in a way, and all the connections in between the different levels of management, starting from the very bottom to the very top. So that's impressive. I think, I mean, it's something we can see already is the complexity that we have shown today, like from these 3 different perspectives, like somehow around this common topic or this common area. We have seen three very different ways of trying to develop a more sustainable built environment and different scales with different participation and so on. And maybe from there, I would like to introduce a first question just to start the conversation. And maybe while you share your thoughts, you can also make a comment or say, or throw a question to a different presenter. I would like to know from you, what do you think that are some of the similarities or the differences that you see between the work that have been shown today? I don't know if someone want to start.
I'll go ahead and start just because I spoke most recently, maybe, but I think what a lot of what we have tried to do, and it feels there's a common thread, is the recognition that so many of these decisions have been made top down. And that really doesn't work. And it definitely doesn't work for communities. And so then really trying to understand how to both let communities define their own well-being and what it is that they need, but then how to engage them in the process so that they can achieve it, is really critical. And you know, here in the US, agencies like the Corps of Engineers, but even the National Science Foundation and the National Academies of Sciences have always treated the kind of work from on high as a priority, rather than seeing the value and what you draw from communities who have to live in these places.
Maybe adding to that also, that is somehow in the US seems to be expected that there are some institutions that will support you, while we saw Mexico and Ecuador, like they are by themselves somehow, right?
Yeah, maybe I can add something on that. So as I was telling you since the beginning, right now I'm working for the European Commission, so it's a completely different environment. Like, what can be more institutionalized than the European Commission? However, even though there are no, let's say, constitutions that look like the Ecuadorian one, it's also true that I believe that by analyzing public policies, it's complicated, but we can think of alternatives. There are some policy examples or initiatives that I do see they have some value that on working with it. For example, there is the Leipzig Charter in Europe. There is now it will become a mission very probably. I don't know if you heard about the new European Bauhaus. So there are those initiatives that are coming from top down, but they are trying to look much more into what community would like to say and how they can contribute. Probably we're not talking about autonomy, we're not talking about self-construction, but we are hearing more and more that in order to face climate change, we need to start looking from the bottom. We need to look at nature-based solution coming from the place. And as well also ways of how people have been used to dialogue and have an impact. So the idea of the right to the city should really be an all-encompassing principle that, yes, it's hard to find, but I do believe that really by looking at space and urbanism and our role and our training, but also looking at policies. We tend, at least from, I would say, Fabio knows it very well, in Venice, they were two completely opposites endeavor. I think that try to work with those things and try to understand what can be done in this perspective. It's an experimentation that I would really invite the students to look at their context, look at the policies, and try to see if there are ways to start implementing something in a different way.
Yes, and I just want to add that, I mean, resuming a little bit of what you just said, designing with nature and designing with people, it becomes a need right now because of climate change, and as well because all the knowledge that people has on their own environment. I mean, they have been living there for such a long time, and it's very important not just listen, but start to seeing and understand how they have resolved their lives in the territories and add some knowledge. But it's like this knowledge exchange and designing with nature and people. I mean, it's very clear how nature, how water, it's returning or even getting to new places where it was not before, and as well all these social and natural social disasters that we've seen in many places. So I think for now on, it's very important to take into account designing with people and nature.
Yeah, that I don't know if it's Irene or Anicia or anyone else, I mean, have a comment or a question that want to add to the discussion.
I have like 10, but I'm really excited about the resonances between your 3 projects and bodies of work. But maybe building off of this conversation's happening right now, I was really struck by the recurrence of the word well-being, Traci, right? And how do communities define well-being? And, you know, in the Ecuadorian constitution, this idea of buen vivir, I think is a reasonable translation of this idea. So maybe a question is, like, in your practices or in your research, how are people that you're working with defining well-being for themselves, and what implications does that, like concrete implications does that have for built or constructed environments? Thanks.
I can go ahead and start. I will say that, as Fabio mentioned, I spent 10 years kind of in practice. And so I spent a lot of time working directly with communities. The Inland from the Coast grant came from the National Academies of Sciences, but it was actually a partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so the idea of community well-being was something that we had to include. I don't know if I had thought about it as much before through that lens. And what working in those communities and what it helped me to understand is that well-being, there are, you know, safety and not dealing with compounded impacts of hazards, and there's some kind of obvious things, but also it is just letting people define what it is that they want in their community and what they want for their future. And that is rarely the starting point when we do design. And, you know, I'm an urban planner, and there's often a kind of knee-jerk reaction to downplay the value of suburban areas, right? Like, oh, these are part of the problem. We need to get, people love them. And there are suburban communities. Baker is a community where people live there because that's how they want to live. So it's not my job or anybody else's job to say it's wrong. It's to try and understand what elements of that they love, and then how do we enhance them and then make them safer? How do we make sure that things they love about those communities can be designed in without judgment? And so that project started in 2017. And for me, it really changed the way I think about it. It is, you have to walk in the door first and say, what is it you love about this place? And then we as designers have to figure out how that translates to something that it accomplishes all of those things. And what counts to people most is the places where they get to be a community. So that has to be at the forefront. And then we bake all of the other resilience or, you know, risk reduction measures into it, because people don't care about stormwater, right? Like, that's not really, they care when it's in their house, but that's not what they want to think about. They want to think about how their community is a place that they love. And so how can we do both of those? That's how I approach it, at least.
Mm-hmm. Traci, and to the larger group, thank you everyone for being here and all the presenters. I actually wanted to sort of continue that thread of thinking about well-being is something that, you know, I think we all value very much. But in particular, thinking about approaches to design and scales within which we work in terms of design. And in particular, Traci, I just left a comment about working with community partners for you in the chat, but a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. You sort of mentioned that top down, right, doesn't work. And you have several engagements where it's thought to be the only way, that it could work. But I think you are starting to embody that in the way that you actually conduct your studios. The students are seeing it. So one question would be, and, I think it could apply to all the speakers, how do you approach different entities that might see one approach versus the other as the better way or the sort of effective way? And you could speak specifically to how do you convince a group of probably stakeholders to other different entities that, a bottom-up approach could, really sort of render some successful outcomes?
I would argue, I'm not trying to say that I think only bottom up works or only top down, because at the scale that we need to do coastal restoration work in Louisiana, we need somebody from the top with a lot of money. But what gets built, how it gets built, and what conversations are had, that it's always kind of stopped at a community engagement level where you get to give your comments. So we have worked very hard to try and bridge that gap and to show that the large infrastructure projects are crucial, but the community-based projects are just as important, right? And that whether it's the same people doing the investing or someone else, they need to do it. Part of what you do is you get those people who build the infrastructure to fund your work. So they have to listen at least a little bit, because they're paying for it sometimes. So to be working with the Corps of Engineers through their Engineering with Nature program, but being given enough autonomy that I can say, I'm bringing students in from all over the world, and they're going to work together, and they're going to work with these partners, and they're going to come up with plans that make you think differently about how the work can get done. And it helps. The other thing we are doing is packaging it all and giving it to any partner who can use it. So we give it to the city of Biloxi, we give it to nonprofit organizations, we give it to small governments, because if they can go get a grant that helps them build their greenway that reduces flooding and it includes walking paths and benches and things like that, then that's great. I don't want to keep it for myself. I want to give it to them so that they can use it to build their own vision, even if the large agencies aren't going to help. Because there are funders out there that will do it.
Giulia, I saw you were, going to say something.
Yeah. No, I mean, lots of questions. I'm trying to start from this one that you just asked. So how to convince them? How do you convince the top down to listen to the bottom up? I'm always very confident in the power of mapping, not just of space, but also of actors. So we're used to live in a welfare system where we receive things, but sometimes they're not what we want, and sometimes they become completely destroyed and we're not ready on how to restore it. And if we are citizens that is under an earthquake or a landslide or whatever, we normally sit and wait. So I believe that building up on scenarios and mapping, it's really crucial. So starting mapping which are the actors that could be involved in the future, which is the situation now and which was the situation in the past. Can we find any patterns that have not been considered so far? Can we start considering citizens as power, not just a receiver? So I think that inside the university, what is very interesting and what we have been trained a lot to do is about scenario construction. So what if this happened? How could we, what if? Then you can go to utopias, as I did. But then I think that looking at utopias, Galeano was saying this, is a way to look forward. So you never reach it, but it's a way to start looking what could happen if. I think that more complex we do those analyses in those scenarios, and more disciplines we put together, and more we're able to show policymakers and people who have money. And it was just mentioned that this has a power that should be listened.
Isadora, how you feel about this? Maybe you don't have to convince anyone.
Well, yeah, at the beginning of our work, but as soon as we have just, I mean, we start to have results, more people have finance the work, no? Or after a disaster, it's easily as well that people get more solidary with our work, no? So it's very important. But for us, it's important to make this community assessment in which we map as well. I think cartography is a very good tool to understand the territory, to understand also how people organize and leave the territory, all the hazards and so on. So from there, we can build together the solutions. So, and with this assessment as well, we can talk with financiers and tell them what is happening and what do people need, no? So it's the way we work. Yeah.
Thank you all. The second year LSU students are showing up in the chat. Thank you. So Abby put an observation that I'll try to just sort of summarize about how I understand it, like a rupture or a disconnection between people and communities that have traditionally or historically had relationships with their physical environments. This is resonating with me because I actually just came off of a workshop about the Haitian Lakou, which I think has some similarities to the rural settlements that Isadora shared with us, where people live in a collective form in coordination with nature. So I think this is a really rich thematic. Then question for all of you to reflect on. For Mason, is there a shared urban-rural makeup in these vulnerable areas of Mexico, Ecuador, and southern Louisiana? Do you think similar housing initiatives are applicable here? I think here is speaking to Southeast Louisiana. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely something about rurality and urbanity that's at play here. And I would, yeah, maybe you could reflect on what the role of rural development is and what sort of ideologies come through there. The second part of his question, I think, points towards like kind of government intervention, but I think we've touched on that a little bit. So I'd like to focus there with a complicating, I'm sorry, this is how my brain goes, with a complication, because I know Giulia, you're talking about urban space, but I think maybe urban rural is the wrong frame, because I think there's something about the migas, these small collectives in a different geography that brings up some of the similar ideas. So what does it mean to do housing in rural spaces? Okay.
Well, I think that what Abby said, there is one thing that I think we need extremely careful about. Let's try not to romanticize. I don't want to say that before there was a lot of cooperation and then welfare arrives and everything disappears somehow. But Mingas were super hard works, were super tiring. They were doing it during weekends. I saw pregnant women all of the time and with no resources. Sometimes I saw by interviews that this was a nightmare. So it's not that it is a solution that cooperation will solve everything. And as well, the word makeup, there is no makeup. Like every single context has a completely different reality. It's very likely that in Louisiana, if you propose a Minga, people will arrive because they find it interesting at the very beginning, but then, no, thank you, what is that? So I think it's all about trying to understand what is culturally embedded with the place and try to understand which can be the channel of dialogue in order to foster it. So probably you will, and yeah, I think that Isadora can say much more about this. You won't build houses in, let's say, rural areas in the US with Adobe, but you might find other technologies and other things. So again, I think what is extremely important is to analyze the context, and starting from there, trying to understand what it is possible without romanticizing that collectivity solves everything. Again, in these times in Ecuador, they were doing mingas because the state was absent. To me, the challenge here is really, can we involve policymakers to listen to us so that the two things are not separate? I think that solution can come just by analyzing the case, and never being scared of proposing something that is extreme. You have always time to go back and make it smaller.
Yeah, and in case of rural areas in Mexico, it was really common years ago to do, well, tequio, mano vuelta. There are different words in Mexico to describe it, but this mutual support or minga, and because, I mean, the money was not needed to build, no? And nowadays we found out, like in these bajareque houses, they have to go and cut the wood in the woods and then to put the mud in the walls, and it's a very hard work. So nowadays it's so expensive if you have like 10 people doing these works, no? So but on the other hand, it's a way of organization that doesn't need to pay. So we during the reconstruction tried to recover these ways of organize that the community, I mean, in some communities they still doing it, but another not that much. And because now they pay for the labor, no? So it's quite interesting that before, I mean, they have no money, but they have these ways of organize. And now, well, they start have other works out of the community, so they start earning money, and now they can pay some of the work for constructing their house. But I mean, the work with Cooperación Comunitaria, we encourage them to recover this organization way of working, no? And it has been really interesting how people remember, people start to value this other way of working, no? Because as well, all the paying labor has been really hard to get to the communities, no? For people to work. And well, yes, mainly that. And it's, I mean, now we have realized that some traditional construction systems like Adobe, it's easy to do and it's easy to pay, but bajareque, nowadays it's almost impossible to build it if you have no money, no? So I mean, it's interesting. Yeah. Sorry, my English is not so good. I hope you could understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, interestingly, you know, I have done quite a bit of work in these South Louisiana communities at my own research. And when you interview people about this process of migrating away from the coast and what has happened, these are people who historically lived on the edge of the earth, right? Like they lived down there, they were completely self-sufficient. It's a very distinct cultural set of communities. It's the largest Native American populations in the US, and it's also, or not in the US, in Louisiana concentrations, but also it's the Cajun culture. So people who have lived down here and have had to be flexible and adapt over time. And so without the being impeded by kind of modern day building requirements, people always lived a very different lifestyle. They probably had multiple small houses, some way out in the water, some further inland, and maybe upland, where they could migrate with seasons or fishing seasons and patterns, things like this. And so in order to maintain community in these places, we are going to have to become more flexible. And when you talk to the people down there, they know it. And they have adapted in ways that are astonishing if you go down there to see how people have built their own structures that can withstand hurricanes and floods and storms and things like that, so that they can continue to live in these places. So there's a lot to be learned from the people who are already there. And they'll tell you, we've been adapting to climate change and land loss for hundreds of years down here, right? Like we have, you know, people's parents who lived way out in the edges, and those communities might be gone, but they also didn't have air conditioning and electricity. And it's a lot nicer in South Louisiana to be in a place with AC and running water. So, you know, there are lots of adaptations, and I think we'll see more of those as we continue to address, you know, if we want to continue to live in these places, we're going to have to adapt the way we think about it. And then the only other thing that I would say, and maybe this is to Mark's point, is the studio, quite a bit of my work, but the studio that Haley and I are running right now, these are in rural communities that we're looking at. And we're looking at them not as the people on the edge, but as the receiver communities. As people have to move inland, how do you make sure they have a place to go? And that fits their kind of the lifestyle they want. Again, not everybody's going to want to move to Houston or New Orleans. A lot of people want to continue to live in small rural communities. And so building public spaces, building communal, building cultural programming, but also building housing that can absorb those people in advance of a storm, so that they have somewhere to go, not when their life has been completely upended, but actually as they are able to make those decisions over time. And so we are doing that with 2 separate communities in South Louisiana, rural communities, to think about that rural migration and giving those places, but also to have our students think about, what does that mean? What does it mean to create communities that are welcoming, that can bring population in, and not have one type of housing, but actually have a variety of housing types, and some of these things that are really key to how people make decisions about where they live and where they go. So
Thank you so much, Traci. And also, I'm glad that you are connecting with Mark's comment, because I have the horrible task to have to close this session. But this is only the first of 6 sessions that we will have during this fall and spring. There is no way, I mean, I cannot say something that would synthesize that what's being discussed today. This is very complex. There are many things to be considered. I'm just going to say thank you everyone for being here. This is showing a lot about what we have been talking about, the complexities of the different angles and perspective around this geographical broad area. Also, I would like to share, as Mark was commenting, we'll have his session on October 13, where I'm sure we will be discussing again this relation between research and pedagogy. So if you are an LSU student, you will receive the Zoom link to join the session. If you are not, please go ahead and register on the website so you can get the link on your email. Again, thank you all. Thank you, Giulia, Traci, Isadora, and also in particular, now that I see them, thank you, translators. I have Marcela and Sol, who did a great job. I mean, I have been changing channels and they are just awesome. Keeping Traci's speed, so that's also like a bonus. So again, thank you everyone. See you next time.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm just gonna